So our speaker tonight is Jacob Holland-Lulewicz, who's currently a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. He received his Ph.D. in 2018 from the University of Georgia, and his research across the Southeastern and Midwestern U.S. focuses primarily on the archaeology of governance, politics, and social networks. And we're really excited to have you here tonight, Jake, and I'll stop sharing and you can take it away.
Cool. Hi, everybody. I'm excited to at least be zooming into Florida. I very much miss the South. It's currently freezing rain outside. So I'll just pretend like I'm there with you. Let me figure out how to share this. Okay. Can you see this, Jamie?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me, everyone. I'm really excited to talk to you. I always love talking about stuff that I like to people who want to hear about it. And as Jamie mentioned, I'm super interested in government and politics very broadly. And obviously, as an archaeologist, I'm very interested in the deep histories of different forms of governance and different political systems and things like this. And so today, what I want to do is essentially bring you through 1,500 years of history in the Southeastern United States. Specifically, I want to talk about the 1,500-year history of council houses and councils in the Muscogean ancestral areas of Georgia, northern Florida, and some surrounding regions. And I think, at least I have been thinking that council houses are really, really fascinating forms of governance. And they're really fabulous examples of inclusive forms of governance that can contribute a lot to global conversations about cooperative, collective, and democratic forms of governance, which we usually situate as kind of coming from what we like to call Western societies, right? And so I do want to start just really quickly with the idea of democracy and what it is and how people have thought about it in ways that has been defined and treated by historians and sociologists and political scientists. And there's usually three ways that democracy is treated. It's either treated as occurring and emerging specifically in Western societal contexts like Greece. This is the birth of our democracy, and it stands alone as this bastion from which all other inclusive forms of politics emerged, right? The other way is by realizing that democratic forms of government existed throughout long swaths of our human history, but that some of these were, to quote, primitive democracies, right? They weren't really our modern democracies. And then there are more recent views of democracy that really do grab on to and recognize the indigenous kind of contributions to democratic ideas and principles, not just in the indigenous Americas, but indigenous societies around the world, or kind of traditionally non-Western societies, right? And one of these, some of these folks who are thinking about this way are Graeber and Wengrow. This is specifically from online essay they had a few years ago. But of course, they also have a brand new big book out that you may have seen, The Dawn of Everything, in which they talk a lot about this as well. But really what we're talking about when we're talking about, at least what we need to be talking about when we're talking about democracy, is what exactly does it mean to be democratic? How do we know if something is democratic or not? How do we measure this? And this is really important from an archaeological and historical perspective, where we have to know what we're looking for in the past. And specifically, we have to look for the material kind of residues and signatures of these practices in the past, right? And so today, when I'm talking about democracy, I'm specifically going to be talking about just kind of broadly inclusive politics. And what I mean by this is forms of government that really create these broad webs of participation versus what we might think of as tall towers, where there's one kind of authoritative autocratic state and everything is subsumed under this hierarchical tall tower, right? We're looking for cases where we're really building these broad webs of government, where there are lots of voices and there's the inclusion of lots of diverse institutions within governance, right? So we can think of something like a modern democracy, like the U.S. Congress, right? Versus like a totalitarian state, right? Broad webs versus tall towers. And really, if we then kind of start to think in this way, we can identify some axes where we can really start to measure and characterize different kinds of democracy, or at least different institutions that facilitate democracy, right? So for instance, going back to, the US Congress or our federal government, we can measure the scale of participation. We can measure what kind of participation is actually encouraged, and we can look at and kind of think about how equitably distributed power and authority are, right? So the scale of participation for us in our country is quite broad, right? Everyone gets a vote, essentially. The scope of participation is probably a little bit less than we might imagine, right? How much power does a single vote have? And then in terms of equitable distribution of power, you can imagine a lot of the decisions made here are distributed across many institutions, Congresses, courts, state level governments, city level governments, right? There's lots of checks and balances and lots of connections between all these institutions, right? We can start really thinking of this image of broad webs. Right. So if we want a nice little metaphor for this, we could think of something like a braided cable versus a single thick filament, right? The thick filament is going to be more brittle. It's going to be less resilient to tension, right? We really want governments and politics that look like this braided cable, where lots of different decision-making bodies and voices and institutions are being brought into the fold of governance, right? And so we can start to look at these things archaeologically and historically. And importantly, we can start to compare across time and space, right? So whether or not we have a braided government, right, or a braided system of institutions articulating in really diverse ways, or we have these tall towers, really depends on what these particular keystone institutions are doing, right? What are our actual institutions of government doing, right? And so we can go back to those three kind of characteristics I talked about in terms of scale of participation, scope of participation, and equitable distribution of power. And we can measure those for very specific institutions, right? We can do this for something like the US Congress, the ancient Greek Athenian Assembly, the Icelandic Althing, right? And these are very classical Western conceptions and iterations of democracy. But once we realize that we're comparing material institutions, actual groups of people doing things, we can bring a lot more different societies historically and spatially into these comparisons, right? We can start thinking about how Iroquois and clan systems facilitate equitable governance. We can think about how Puebloan sodalities facilitate widespread participation. And today we're going to think about how Muscogean councils serve a similar democratic role as a lot of these classically Western things, right? And so by recognizing that we're measuring actual institutions and not just societies writ large and how democratic they are, we can really start to move across a lot of the categories that stifle really good comparative research, right? We no longer have to be concerned with if something is a Western or a non-Western society. We don't have to be concerned with whether or not a society is a state or non-state. We don't have to be concerned with a modern or a pre-modern government. All of these kind of categories really, they no longer matter because all we're doing is comparing the properties of those institutions of government. And today we're going to look kind of at a deep, long-term history of one of these non-Western forms of governance, the Muscogean Council House, right? And so A lot of you are down here in Florida tonight. I'm all the way up here in St. Louis. We're going to talk about Georgia. Specifically, we're going to zoom into the Southern Appalachian region. And of course, the not so spoiler alert is that Muscogean council houses are, of course, still around today. And this is a big part of the story. And it's something we're going to talk about a lot in terms of these institutions being really, really resilient and really durable. All right. So here's kind of the ancestral Muscogean homelands. Of course, the modern Muscogee Creek Nation is located in Oklahoma over here today, where there are this picture right here, at least, of a modern council house that I'll get to a little later in the talk, that is located in Oklahoma. Oh, wait, I'll talk to you about it in the next slide. This is the Dyr Roundhouse. It's relatively new, and it still plays a really critical part in the political process of the Muscogee Creek Nation, and especially bringing the political process to citizens of the Muscogee Creek Nation in terms of coming together, discussing ideas, reaching consensus. It has even served as a venue for candidates, the presidential candidates for the Muscogee Creek Nation, to come and talk about ideas and to talk with Muscogee Creek Nation citizens. So it still plays a really important part in the politics of Muscogean society. And through history, right, and we're going to start all the way back at its beginnings, the council really works to build these broad webs that we were talking about, right? So ethnohistorically, ethnographically, archaeologically, from contemporary understandings of Muscogean societies, we know that lots of institutions were really important to making these societies work. And to individuals kind of role within society, right? We know that households were really important institutions. We know that lineages were really important for defining relationships between people. We know that tribal towns are really important, right? Towns themselves are probably some of the most autonomous, politically independent institutions in Muscogean society and history. There are regional networks, right? And then there's, of course, the clan system. And what the council itself does is create a space for representation from all of these different institutions, right? It serves as the tether through which these institutions are braided, right? Remember that kind of braided cable that's really strong? The council is the blueprint for how that cable is being braided. And we know councils have existed for a long time. We have lots of archaeological evidence for them. We have lots of historical and ethnohistoric evidence for them. And then, of course, we know they exist today, right? So here's an example from a 17th century council house at Mission San Luis. Here in the upper right, this is from Irene on the Atlantic coast from the 14th century. Here's one from Etowah in northwestern Georgia from the 13th century. And these existed all over that kind of Muscogean core homeland in Tennessee, and even townhouses in North Carolina, even though kind of outside that, that traditional boundary for Muscogean speaking groups. So some of the earliest of these council houses that we knew of before what I'm going to talk to you about today were likely dating back to about 900 or 1000, but not too much further before that, potentially even later. Some of these much bigger ones, we're looking at like the 12th or 13th centuries. And this is before our more recent work in northern Georgia, in the Oconee Valley. This is the Wallace Reservoir at the site of Cold Springs. And my title's not showing up, but this little star is centered on the site of Cold Springs. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what we've been doing there and why it's so important for this story of council houses. So Cold Springs was excavated in the 70s alongside lots and lots of other sites up and down the Oconee Valley. Of course, because it was going to be inundated and it would become the Wallace Reservoir or Oconee Lake today, or Lake Oconee today. So it's one of these sites where we have really, really extensive excavations. All of these black boxes over here are places that were excavated. There's 2 mounds. And as we'll see, there's likely a plaza area. There's a few structures scattered around. This really isn't a town. And what it looks like, it really looks similar to what we know of Muscogean square grounds or ceremonial grounds. There's a plaza, there are mounds, there's attendant architecture. It really lines up with kind of what we know about what Creek square grounds look like. And this is very cool because it stretches this tradition all the way back, at least to kind of the woodland period in Georgia. And we know that mound and plaza kind of settlements existed across the Southeast for much, much longer than this. So this isn't too surprising or shocking, but it's cool to make this comparison nonetheless, and to see this pan out in the archaeological record. What was super interesting though, and or maybe I should say curious, were these kind of round structures down here. They're quite large. They're about 15 meters in diameter, right? They're located just to the southeast of the plaza, opposite from the mounds. There you've got a lot of internal post moles, likely marking where benches once were. They have entrances. And we were super excited for these because we thought we would get some nice, undated, previously unknown examples of Mississippian council houses. Let's see how this went. So what we did is we got 40 new dates from across the site, all from archived and curated materials that were excavated from the 70s. And we placed the main occupation of the site. There are a few Mississippian kind of later structures scattered around, but the main occupation, the mounds, most of the structures and the features, and likely the plaza arrangement. This is all dating to between about 500 and 700, or potentially more specifically to about 550 to 650. So a solid kind of single century. Mound A dates right in that period. Mound B dates right in this period. And our dates from the round structures, surprisingly, also put them right into this period. Given their shape, given their internal kind of complexity of posts, given their size, they line up archaeologically with what we know Muscogean council houses to look like. So this was really quite exciting, especially because this puts these about 400 to 500 years earlier than when we thought council houses were supposed to have emerged in this region, right? And this is just, these are some more features at the site, but everything, all of these, they fall into this 100 to 150 year period, right? And so councils, at least this far back by 500, are playing this really, really critical role in holding these institutional arrangements together and building these wide webs of governance. What's very cool is that what we're likely seeing, it's not necessarily that these are the earliest in the Southeast, but these are now the earliest known, right? So this is a potential case where we can actually study why councils may have emerged in the first place. And this is what we're continuing to work through, right? Because we know they played a super important role for the next 1,500 years and continue to do so, right? But why did they actually emerge? What role did they play? Well, it's likely that these council houses emerged as institutions to bind together kind of disparate, autonomous, and potentially competing realms of decision-making. We know that councils ethnohistorically have representatives from households, lineages, clans, men, women, elders. And these are really institutionalized spaces for consensus building. And so what's happening at this time on the landscape, AD 500, in this northern Georgia region? Well, we know that groups are settling down. We know that households are kind of scattered across the landscape. There's no big, huge villages. Cold Springs itself isn't really a village. It's likely serving dispersed households. So people are settling down. People are filling in the landscape. We're likely getting population growth. We are coming out of, at least a few centuries beforehand, potentially, we're coming out of these really big, large-scale continental hopewell networks that have broken down. And so this is a landscape where there's real potential for conflict, right? And there's a real need for people to come together collectively and decide how resources are going to be distributed, how territories and boundaries are going to be marked between groups that are settling down. And it looks like the solution to this was the council, which is very cool. And again, this is kind of the next phase of this research is going a lot deeper into these kind of contexts of this emergence. What exactly is happening? Why is it happening at Cold Springs? What this does do, however, and what we can start to rethink are these longer histories of Indigenous governance in the Southeast, especially in this region of Georgia, right? And the first thing that comes to my mind is, what about chiefs? We know ethnohistorically and ethnographically that chiefs, which is, this is what we call them. The actual term would be Mikos, right? They're members of the council. The Miko is a role within the council. And so when we start to get into the Mississippian period, when we do get these huge villages, huge towns, right? And we get marked inequality and political instability. Who exactly are the chiefs, right? Originally, we thought maybe councils emerged during this time, potentially to balance chiefs, or potentially to deal with people moving into large towns or villages. But we know by this time, councils had already been around for 500 to 700 years. And these big, important chiefs are members of those councils, right? And so the normal kind of story that we tell in the Southeast is that what we see during the Mississippian period is the emergence of a new form of governance, the chiefdom, right? A new institution and a new way to govern that is highly hierarchical. But given the deep kind of history and antiquity of councils, we kind of have to begin to rethink what exactly is happening here, right? So of course, people are gaining prestige and wealth. There's no doubt that there's marked inequality. But we really need to start thinking about how much power these individuals actually have, right? And whether or not they continue to be constrained by the checks and balances put on them by the council. So that's kind of going forward. That's some of the big questions we have. And my work, along with lots of other people's work, like Lynn Sullivan, I don't know if she's in the audience today. She says she might be. But Lynn and myself and other people working in the Southeast have actually shown that during this time period, even though we do get kind of these big, potentially powerful leaders, it's Lynn, there you are. There's a lot of questions that remain about how hierarchical these systems actually were, and whether or not these actually disrupted long-standing networks. So my work has shown that social networks, in terms of kinship networks, networks of clan, and just the ways people interacted with each other across the landscape, they were not interrupted by the emergence of these powerful chiefs. And Lynn has showed some similar things over time in Eastern Tennessee. And so this, the early emergence of the council could be a key component in kind of bolstering some of those arguments that have been put out there, that maybe we're kind of overplaying this hierarchical model, right? Maybe there wasn't as much political inequality as we thought there was. But a big lesson we learned from this is that even when we have inclusive forms of governance like the council, who build these really wide webs of participation, it's really, really hard to mediate and bar against inequality, right? And this is an important lesson. And it's one that should be pretty normal to us, right? Because we live in this big participatory democracy with equitable voice, but ideally on paper. But at the same time, inequality runs rampant, right? If we could solve that problem, we'd go ahead and go pick up our Nobel Peace Prizes, right? So it's one thing to think about and facilitate equitable governance, but that doesn't necessarily translate to equitable society, right? Okay, in any case, chiefs and these really kind of inequitable systems that we see emerge during the Mississippian time, about 1400 into 1500, and even by the time the Spanish get here, the extravagance of all of this is really beginning to play down. And what we learn is that these hierarchical systems, if they were as such, were super unstable. They have life cycles of about 75 to 100 years. And by the time the Spanish arrive, councils are once again front and center in the process of politicking. And so at least over the very long term, the council is able to retain its kind of centrality in this process of governance and rein in some of these potentially very powerful people that emerged during the Mississippian period. And so that brings us to this next point about resilience. And so we know councils were a very prominent feature of Indigenous societies at contact, through contact, and they remain so today, right? Councils are really robust and resilient institutions. And when it comes to colonialism, it seems that the council was able to anchor social, political, and economic adaptations to the new kinds of interactions between Indigenous groups and arriving Europeans. And we'll talk a little bit about how they did this and how we can see it archaeologically. And so a lot of traditional narratives of colonialism and contact start with ideas of collapse or shatter or failure on the part of Indigenous systems to endure these changes, right? And this simply is just, the spoiler here is that this is just simply not the case. And I'm gonna show you one little study to potentially challenge some of these ideas. And so the reason that we have these kinds of narratives of collapse are borne out in the archaeological record. It just comes down to how we're interpreting this though, right? So if we zoom back to the Oconee Valley where Cold Springs is, but we zoom forward about 1,000 years into the 16th and 17th century, what we see is we don't have the big towns we saw in the Mississippian period. We see lots of dispersed houses. We see little to no European artifacts. We see no more mound building, or at least we didn't see it before. And the narrative here is that we have a collapse or a shattering of Indigenous systems and traditions, right? And part of this, I'll just go on to the next one. Let's just zoom to our study now at the site of Dyr to address some of these kind of long-standing narratives. Dyr is a large platform mound with a few scattered potential houses, right? There's no big towns like I mentioned. But on top of the Dyr Mound, this is a plan view of excavations on top of the Dyr Mound, which was also excavated in the 70s as part of this reservoir project. We have some really classic examples of Mississippian traditions and religion and ritual. We have these kind of closed, connected structures that were likely used for ritual or preparation of medicines. We have open air structure on a lower terrace of the mound top that was likely used for food preparation. So really kind of what we would think of as really classic examples of Mississippian culture and tradition. Right, here's the very top section of the mound, zoomed in, and all of these little kind of black lines, those are burnt layers of these structures, right? So these were rebuilt over some time, and they exist at the top of this platform mound over here. And because this was a not WPA, I'm sorry, that was that was 50 years before this. Because this was a reservoir project in the 70s, we have really unprecedented kind of archaeological record in terms of what was excavated, because all of this was going to be inundated. So we have this entire profile of a Mississippian platform mound, which is really rare for the Southeast. At least, rare, at least for such an excavation to have been done to modern standards, at least. And so for a long time, like I mentioned, because there were no European artifacts here, it was assumed that Dyr was abandoned and the valley was abandoned right after Spanish contact, probably in the 1540s, between the 1540s and 1560s. And the narrative is that this was a collapse and there's depopulation because of disease and political instability. But again, that's based on the presence or absence of particular materials, right? And so we came in and we thought to ourselves, well, maybe we should get some actual hard radiocarbon dates up and down the profile of this mound. And so we did this. We got about 30 new dates up and down this mound. Here's the start of this mound. I had to split this up a little. All we're really worried about, though, is this date right up here, which comes from the very top of that mound, where we have those really classic examples of Mississippian traditions. And that date for those structures comes in at about 1670. So this is 130 years after DeSoto and his crew came through the Oconee Valley, right? This is a much different story than abandonment and collapse and disintegration of kind of traditional cultural practices and religious practices. Now, remember, this mound exists in this landscape of dispersed households, right? So it would have been that households would have been coming here for particular purposes, but it would seem that there are other aspects of what were once Mississippian towns that are also spread across this landscape. And one of those features is a council house. And if you're an archaeologist with a trained eye to dots on maps, you'll notice a circular shape here. This is about 15 meters in diameter. It's located at the Joe Bell site, which is seems to be an associated square ground connected to Dyr and connected to these dispersed households, right? So even though we've gotten rid of the institution of the town or the community, other institutions like households, like the clan system, like lineages, and the council remained intact through this really critical kind of period in history, right? So it would seem that the council continued to anchor Indigenous politics. And while we see institutional arrangements kind of reorganized and recalculated, and some of them failing or potentially kind of losing their importance, like the town, they all remained articulated with one another through the council. And of course, today, these councils remain, right? And they continue to exist in Oklahoma today and serve a really important purpose in Muscogee society. And what's really cool about this study, I think, is that we extend the genealogy of this practice really definitively back into the ancestral Muscogean homeland, right? This is a really robust empirical tie between practices that are happening today in Oklahoma and practices that happened by these people's ancestors 1,500 years ago. An important part of this study has also been that a lot of this work itself has brought together not only academic archaeologists like myself and Forest Service archaeologists, but it has been undertaken with members of the Muscogee Creek Nation. And so our co-authors on a lot of these papers we've been writing have been Raylan Butler, Turner Hunt, and Leon Wendt, who are the archaeologists for the Muscogee Creek Nation Cultural and Historic Preservation Division. And so it's been a really, really cool collaboration where not only have we done some really excellent archaeology, answered some really cool questions about kind of inclusive politics and governance, and highlighted this really cool case of indigenous democracy, but we've also, like I mentioned before, really reinforced these ties between Muskogee citizens who've been removed from Georgia and their really, really deep kind of ancestries in this area. So to give a summary here, what have we learned? Let's bring it back and kind of zoom out a little bit. We know that councils served a really critical role in articulating the institutional arrangements that gave form to Muscogean societies, right? So the way that people related to each other, the networks that emerged across the landscape, the way that households related to lineages, related to clans. Councils served a really important part in defining these relationships and making sure they survived over the really long term, right? We also learned that inclusive forms of governance depend on institutions like the council that preserve this institutional diversity and autonomy within a particular arrangement, right? And so the council did not seek to, or the institution of the council didn't seek to subdue other institutions, right? It sought to bring them together, right? So unlike a totalitarian or autocratic state that seeks to control other institutions and bring them in line, the council served to preserve that diversity. Democratic institutions like the council can exhibit really, really extreme resilience, right? They can serve as these really familiar, strong guideposts in the context of potential rearrangements, right? Like during colonialism. And so we might look to these different kinds of inclusive institutions during really turbulent political and social and economic times as bastions to kind of guide our arrangements and adaptations during those times, right? And like I pointed out, one of the most important lessons from this is that equitable forms of government that can distribute power and encourage broad kind of participation by people are not fail-proof guards against emergent inequality, right? You can have really great inclusive governments and still be a society that's mired by kind of inequities at lots of different scales and levels, right? And so that's kind of the story that I wanted to bring to you guys in terms of the Muscogean Council, not only as a really important part of Southeastern history, but as a really cool kind of important case study for broader conversations about what inclusive governments look like and how those that have been kind of traditionally not understood to be democratic can actually contribute a lot of really important insights to our conversations about democracy today. So I'm happy to take any questions from you guys. I'm really excited I got to be here and talk with you, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Jake. That was incredibly interesting research you've got going on.
Thanks.
So anyone go ahead and type a few questions in the chat.
You can type or talk.
Yeah, type or talk.
Dennis, hi.
Hi. Yeah, I was kind of confused because you were saying that some of these things were excavated back in the 70s because it was going to be inundated, but then you were describing the Dyr site, which you're excavating now.
Oh no, those dates were pulled from curated collections.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so the archaeologists in the 70s collected lots of materials that we went back to the boxes and dated those and lined them up with their maps that they drew in the 70s.
Okay, so all these sites you were describing are all inundated now?
Yes, so actually, yes, to different extents and at different times of the year. Actually, I believe there is, I believe the very southeastern part of Cold Springs might not be underwater. but the rest of it is. And then the whole Dyr site is underwater. You could actually go out on Lake Oconee and you can, if you're about waist high in water, you can walk on the top of the mound.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my next question, was how deep are they? Okay. All right. Thanks.
Anything else? It could be unrelated too, if you have any questions about archaeology. Well, oh, do we have any down here? What, if any, influence did such democratic institutions? Oh, this is a really interesting question, and it's really hard to say exactly what kinds of influence. But of course, the big kind of story to point to here is the idea that the Iroquoian system of governance in the Northeast was a huge influence on the founding fathers' kind of architecture of our modern democratic system. I'm not an expert in that. But that book that I mentioned by Graeber and Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, goes very deep into this. Maybe too deep. They could have probably cut it in half, but it's a really excellent treatment of how kind of indigenous philosophy also kind of affected the Enlightenment movement in Europe, which led to a lot of these ideas about democracy. So that's my answer as a non-expert in Iroquoian politics. But there are definitely, if you look that up in terms of the relationship between Iroquois and our modern democracy, you'll find lots of great stuff. Are modern groups using your work data for advocacy? So I think an important part of this work is that it does have value for my colleagues with the Muskogee Creek Nation in their jobs making NAGPRA claims, right? And so this concretely pushes back Muscogean traditions that can be traced all the way to the present back to at least AD 500. And so it can be used in that way to argue for these kinds of cultural affiliations that are also often really hard to establish. So that's the hope. The hope is that, at the very least, the work is not doing any harm to descendant communities, and at the very best is being used to make their jobs easier. Okay, let's see. How does Cold Springs relate to Rock Eagle and Rock Hawk and to Okmulgee? Well, so Okmulgee, likely the earliest groups living at Okmulgee were probably at Okmulgee after Cold Springs, likely around 700 to 800. And even then, they were very small populations at Okmulgee. Whether or not this was like a precursor to Okmulgee is difficult to make those connections. To Rock Eagle, as a woodland kind of structure, I don't know exactly when Rock Eagle dates to, but this could have been another one of those places on the landscape where people living across the valley or the landscape in dispersed houses could come together to reinforce their networks and to reinforce kind of their cooperative relationships with one another. So as a creek square ground, Cold Springs, potentially could have served a similar purpose as places like Rock Eagle and other mound sites across this part of Georgia. Did the color painting of the village with the moat represent Etowah? Oh, yes, it did. Sorry, I didn't even mention. Yeah, the painting I showed you of the Mississippian town, that was a reconstruction of an interpretation of Etowah. Yeah. Were Florida groups traveling to participate in these council meetings? What regions? How do we know they attended? Oh, how do we know they attended? Oh, this is a fabulous question. And this is something we're working on. One of the questions is, how widespread was participation at the council at Cold Springs? And one of the ways we're doing this is we are scanning as many Swift Creek sherds from the site as we possibly can. And Swift Creek sherds are sherds, they're ceramics that are stamped with really intricate designs. And these span across Georgia and Florida. And there is currently a huge database of Swift Creek ceramics from across the region that is being created so that we can map up stamp designs across really long distances. And so once we get all of our Swift Creek ceramics kind of put into the database, we'll be able to see if there were connections between people at Cold Springs and potentially people living all the way down in Florida. But this is a big question going forward in terms of what scale did this council operate at? Because ethnohistorically, we know that there are councils that serve just individual communities. There are councils that serve kind of a few communities. And then there are much larger councils that integrate representatives from lots of smaller councils, right? And so one of the questions is what exactly this council at Cold Springs is doing in terms of integrating people from across the landscape. Yeah, that's a cool question. Where did you begin in your archaeological career? Well, thanks for the compliments, first off. Where did you begin in your archaeological career, or how did you get your foot in the door? So I actually started, I did my undergraduate degree at Arizona State University, where I started as actually an international relations major, so politics and political science. And when I realized I could still study those things, but be an anthropologist, I became an anthropology major and I didn't look back. And so for a long time, or throughout, hold on, my dogs are making. Okay, the joys of Zoom. And so I did lots of archaeology work in the Southwest. And then, one second. Sorry, dogs, 4 dogs. So I did lots of archaeology work in the Southwest. I've done archaeology in the Midwest in Illinois. I've done it across the Southeast in Georgia and Florida and South Carolina and Tennessee. I've done archaeology up in Southern Ontario. Like Jamie mentioned, I got my PhD then at the University of Georgia, where I focused on 1,000-year histories of social networks, right? And I didn't bring much of that in today because we already had a lot to talk about, but we can talk about that another time. So that's kind of how I began my career. It is very typical kind of academic archaeology career. And I just kind of sought out as many opportunities as I could. And now I'm teaching at Washington University in St. Louis, which has just been a really fabulous experience. Were there any petroglyphs found on the site? Not that we know of, not that I know of, or not that was recorded during any kind of initial surveys. But beyond petroglyphs, ethnohistorically, we know that a lot of times the interiors of councils were really wonderfully painted with things like origin stories and myths, and the histories of really important people. So I could, and we don't have any of those, we don't have any of that preserved, but you can imagine it would have been quite striking. COVID dog. No, these are all pre-COVID dogs. Anything else? This is fun. I love this. Oh, thanks. I enjoy talking to people. I do it, I teach 3 courses a semester. So I do 6 courses in a year. And so all I do is just get up in front of people and talk about archaeology. But my job's really easy because a lot of my students are like chemistry and engineers. So I get to be their most fun class. Where can I go to read more about this? So actually, we have 2 papers. No, actually we have 3 papers on this work. The paper on the Dyr site, the big platform mound, that was published a year ago, and you could find it online. Jamie, if you email me, I'm happy to share things for you to email out to a group, or any of you can email me too. If you search for me on Washington University's website, you'll find my email and I can send you any papers. That paper is out. And then the paper, we have 2 papers about the councils. Well, we have 1 paper specifically about Cold Springs that should be out this summer. It's been accepted. And then we have 1 paper specifically about these ideas about Indigenous democracy that should be out in a few weeks. And so, Jamie, I think you followed me on Twitter. You can keep an eye out for those.
Sure, yeah.
Let's see. All right.
That should be a good issue. Actually, I'm on one of those papers too, in the frontiers.
Oh, nice. Oh, the
Yeah.
Florida one. The Florida one. Yeah. Yeah, so that's Jamie and I are both on papers for a special issue of actually a political science journal, where a lot of archaeologists got together and wrote a bunch of papers to try and talk to political scientists and convince them that archaeology is useful.
All right, well, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I just want to thank you again for your time, Jake. It was a great time. Really happy to have you with us.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you guys. This was fun. I'm happy to come back whenever and talk about more things.
Awesome.
All right, cool. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you.